The day before my 16th birthday, I was in a car accident that nearly killed me. While I was lying in the hospital with a collapsed lung and fighting for my life, my mother was at a spa getting a massage. She refused to come to the hospital, even when the doctors begged her to sign the emergency paperwork. Drop your verdict in the comments before the story begins. Let's see if you're right by the end. And if you love revenge stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. My name is Ellie Clark, and this is the story of how my mother chose a spa weekend over her dying daughter, and how one letter from her completely destroyed everything she thought she had. I was 15 years old at the time. My parents had been divorced for 3 years, and I lived with my mother. Our relationship was never great, but I never imagined she would do what she did. On the night of the accident, I was coming back from a friend's house when a drunk driver hit our car. I was rushed to the hospital with severe injuries, including a collapsed lung. The doctors said I needed emergency surgery and that someone had to sign the consent forms immediately. They called my mother multiple times. She didn't come. Instead, she told the hospital staff that she was out of town and couldn't make it. What she didn't tell them was that she was actually at a luxury spa just 40 minutes away from the hospital. When the doctors kept calling and pressuring her to come, she finally picked up the phone and said something that still hurts me till this day. "I'm not leaving for paperwork. I've been planning this weekend for months. Just do whatever you have to do." She hung up. The hospital staff was shocked. They kept trying to reach my father, but he was also unreachable at the time. As my condition started getting worse, the doctors were running out of options. That's when my grandmother stepped in. My grandma drove through the night from another city after my aunt informed her about the accident. She reached the hospital at 4 a.m., signed all the emergency papers, and took full responsibility for my treatment. Because my mother had refused to come and my father was unavailable, the hospital allowed my grandmother to file for emergency temporary custody. I was unconscious for almost 36 hours. When I finally woke up, I was confused and in a lot of pain. The first thing I saw was my grandmother sitting beside my bed. She looked tired but relieved. "Grandma, what happened?" I asked weakly. She held my hand and said softly, "You were in an accident, sweetheart, but you are safe now." I looked around the room and noticed some papers on the table. I slowly reached for them. It was a legal document. Emergency Custody Order. My grandmother's name was written as my temporary legal guardian. I looked at her, confused. "Grandma, what is this?" Before she could answer, the door of my hospital room opened. My mother walked in. She looked angry. Her eyes went straight to the papers in my hand, then to my grandmother. Without even asking how I was, she stormed toward the bed and said in a sharp voice, "She can't do this. I'm her mother. She has no right to take my daughter away from me." My grandmother stood up calmly and replied, "You had every right, Susan, but you chose a spa over your own daughter. The hospital gave me the authority because you refused to come." My mother's face turned red. She looked at me and said, "Ellie, tell her to cancel this. I'm your mother. She can't just take you like this." I stared at her. I was still weak, but I could feel something breaking inside me. For the first time in my life, I looked at my mother and realized something. She didn't care that I almost died. She only cared that someone else had taken control. The atmosphere in the hospital room became extremely tense the moment my mother walked in. She was wearing a white robe, and her hair was still damp, clearly having rushed here straight from the spa after my grandmother's call. She looked at the custody papers in my hand and then glared at my grandmother. "Mom, what the hell is this?" she snapped. "You had no right to do this behind my back. I'm her mother." My grandmother didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at my mother with disappointment and said, "You stopped being her mother the moment you refused to come to the hospital while your daughter was fighting for her life. The doctors called you multiple times, Susan. You chose to stay at the spa." My mother's face turned red with anger. "I was stressed. I needed some time for myself. You don't understand how difficult it is to raise a teenager alone." I slowly sat up on the bed.
even though it hurt. I looked at my mother and spoke for the first time since she entered the room. "Mom, I almost died," I said quietly. "And you were getting a massage?" She looked at me, and for a second I saw something like guilt in her eyes, but it disappeared quickly. "Ellie, don't be dramatic," she said. "You're fine now. The doctors handled everything. There was no need for me to rush here and sign some papers and panic." My grandmother shook her head. "You're unbelievable, Susan. Your daughter was unconscious with a collapsed lung, and you're standing here justifying yourself?" My mother ignored her and looked back at me. "Ellie, tell your grandmother to cancel this custody thing. I'm taking you home once you're discharged. We'll sort everything out as a family." I stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then I asked her something that had been bothering me since I woke up. "Mom, did you even ask the doctors how I was doing? Or did you only come because Grandma took custody?" She didn't answer. That silence told me everything. Over the next few days, my mother kept coming to the hospital, but not to check on me. She came to argue with my grandmother about the custody. She even tried to manipulate me by saying things like, "You're still a minor, Ellie. You can't just decide to live with your grandmother. I'm your legal guardian." But my grandmother had already spoken to a lawyer. Because my mother had refused to come during the emergency, and because I was 15, almost 16, the court allowed my grandmother to keep temporary custody until I turned 18, or until further notice. My mother was furious. One evening, when my grandmother stepped out to get coffee, my mother sat beside my bed and said in a low voice, "You're making a big mistake by supporting her. She's trying to take you away from me. Is this what you want? To live with an old woman instead of your own mother?" I looked at her and replied, "I want to live with someone who actually cares if I live or die." She didn't say anything after that. She just stood up and left. 2 days before I was supposed to be discharged, something happened that completely changed the situation. My grandmother received a letter. It was from my mother's lawyer. The letter stated that my mother was filing for full custody, and that she wanted me to return to her house immediately after discharge. It also mentioned that I was unfit to take care of me because of my age. My grandmother read the letter in silence. Then she folded it and put it inside her purse without saying a word. That night, while I was sleeping, I heard her talking on the phone outside my room. Her voice was low but serious. I couldn't hear everything, but I clearly heard one sentence. "Then we have no choice. We'll have to use it." I didn't know what she was talking about at the time, but 2 days later, everything became clear.
2 days before I was discharged from the hospital, my grandmother received another letter from my mother's lawyer. This time, it was more aggressive. It stated that my mother was filing for full and permanent custody and that she would prove my grandmother was too old and unfit to take care of me. My grandmother read the letter quietly in the hospital corridor. She didn't look worried. Instead, she folded the letter and put it inside her bag. That night, while I was half asleep, I heard her making a phone call outside my room again. Her voice was calm, but serious. "Yes, it's time. Send everything to the lawyer tomorrow morning." I didn't understand what she meant at that time. The next day, my mother came to the hospital with her lawyer. She looked confident, as if she had already won. She sat beside my bed and spoke to me in a soft, fake, sweet voice. "Ellie, sweetheart, I know you're upset with me, but I'm still your mother. You belong with me. Your grandmother is too old to handle a teenager. Once you come home, everything will go back to normal." I didn't say anything. I just looked at her. My grandmother, who was sitting on the other side of the bed, spoke calmly. "Susan, before you take her anywhere, I think you should read something first." She took out a brown envelope from her bag and placed it on the table. My mother's lawyer picked it up and started reading. As he read, his face slowly changed. My mother noticed and asked, "What is it?" The lawyer looked at her and said in a low voice, "Susan, you should read this yourself." My mother took the papers.
As she read them, her face turned pale. Her hands started shaking. The documents contained proof that my mother had been receiving monthly child support money from my father for years, but she had never spent it on me. Instead, she had been using it for her own expenses, spa trips, shopping, and vacations. There were bank statements, receipts, and even messages between her and her friends where she openly talked about using Ellie's money for herself. There was also proof that she had lied to the court years ago about her income to get more child support. My mother looked up at my grandmother in shock. "Where did you get all this?" she asked, her voice trembling. My grandmother replied coldly, "I've been collecting it for the past 2 years. I knew one day you would try to take Ellie away from me. I was just waiting for the right time." My mother's lawyer looked at her and said quietly, "Susan, if this goes to court, you could be charged with fraud. You might even have to return all the money you misused." My mother looked at me, her face filled with panic. "Ellie, please, don't do this. I'm your mother." I looked at her and replied in a calm but firm voice. "You stopped being my mother the day you chose a spa over me while I was dying in the hospital. I'm not going back with you." My mother tried to argue, but her lawyer advised her to stay quiet. He knew the evidence was too strong.
2 weeks later, the court gave its final decision. My grandmother was granted full, permanent custody of me. My mother was ordered to return a large portion of the misused child support money. She was also warned by the judge that any further attempt to harass me or my grandmother would result in legal action. My mother lost the case completely. After the court hearing, she tried to talk to me one last time outside the courtroom. "Ellie, please, I made mistakes, but I'm still your mother. Don't cut me off completely." I looked at her and said, "You made your choice that day in the hospital. Now I'm making mine." I turned around and walked away with my grandmother. Today, I live with my grandmother in her house. I turned 18 last year and started college. My mother tried to contact me a few times after the court case, but I never replied. She eventually stopped trying. Sometimes I think about that night in the hospital when I woke up and saw the custody papers. I was scared and confused back then. But now I understand that my grandmother didn't just save my life that day. She also saved my future. I don't hate my mother anymore. I just don't need her in my life. Because some people only realize your worth when they lose you completely.